Hello, everybody. This is The Current. I'm Clive Priddle, and today I'm very happy to be joined by David Priess. David is the COO of Lawfare, which is a non-profit that is a broadcaster and a publisher in areas of national security and the rule of law. He's also an author, and specifically the book that we're really going to talk about today is his book called How to Get Rid of a President. David, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to see you again and to be able to chat about this. Going back a few years now, I think we both knew that this book would be timely during this administration, but I'm not sure we knew exactly how much so many parts of it would become relevant during the course of a few years.
Yeah, the irony, of course, is that you wrote this book as a history of American presidencies and the various means by which presidents have been replaced.
Mm-hmm.
And you were pretty careful not to talk about the person in the Oval Office, Donald Trump, when you wrote the book. We thought it might be an interesting theoretical issue, but we didn't want to get ahead of the news. The news now is all around us, so I think it's fair game to talk about the situation that we're in. But before we get to that, just give us a terribly quick précis of some of the ways in which the American people or the American administration has got rid of previous presidents.
Yes, you'll recall that when we were chatting about this, we wanted to take a different cut at this because so many books do look at how presidents get into office. And then there have been some very good books that have looked at particular slices of how presidents leave office. That is, impeachment has had a couple of very good books and some recent updates based on current events. But also, they take a very narrow view of doing that. And the problem there is you don't get the wide sweep of all the ways that presidents leave office, and all of them have, except for one. We always have a current one, but all of the previous presidents have, by definition, left office. So I took a look at all the ways that was possible. One way that's the simplest and most direct, of course, is an election. You vote the bum out. And hasn't happened much recently, but it used to happen very often that incumbent presidents would run again and would lose. But you have many other methods. If you don't want to just vote the person out, you can impeach and remove the president for certain particular things. You can invoke the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which allows the president to temporarily transfer powers to the vice president and therefore be removed from the powers and duties of the office. You can actually wait for the president to die. That was an interesting one to look at, but in some cases, like Franklin Roosevelt, it was the only way that political opponents could get him out of office. There are more nefarious ways, of course, and we're not recommending them, but they did happen. We've had 4 presidents removed from office due to assassination. We have had presidents who have been undermined so severely while in office that they were effectively removed, even if they still held the title, such that they were constrained by opponents, or even people in their administration, in a sense, taking on the powers and duties themselves and not giving the president the full power of the office. And then, of course, the most nefarious means of all that we explored here was removing a president preemptively. That is, finding someone who is so eminently qualified for the office, so likely to become a president that will be hard to dislodge, that opponents make sure they never get there in the first place, often by foul means. And a few case studies came up in this, and we left it up to the readers whether or not Hillary Clinton in 2016 was on that list due to the Russian information warfare against the election.
So you mentioned Hillary Clinton, and she's definitely on that list of the presidents that we never had. And there's been a lot of commentary about that. The other thing that strikes me as you go through all those various different ways in which presidents can be removed is the number that cluster around Donald Trump. Given that we only have to remove a president once, here we have a president who has attempted to be impeached, which failed. Nancy Pelosi is currently waving talk of the 25th Amendment around, although that may be for theater, but she brought it up, and I can't remember when last that was seriously brought up as a serious suggestion for getting rid of a sitting president.
Mm-hmm.
We've been worried about his health. The president was hospitalized, and for a brief moment, it was possible that he might actually be seriously ill in office. And then I think a lot of Donald Trump supporters would say that one of the things he's experienced in this presidency is being undermined from within.
Right.
I think that they would look to parts of the establishment that seem to have arrayed themselves solidly and consistently against the Trump presidency, and seem as though the majority of the people in those places would like him to go. So he's a remarkable character for the topic of your book, for how to get rid of a president. And in some respects, it's amazing that he's made it through 4 years.
Yeah, it's certainly been an adventure, because each of these slices of how presidents are removed from office or could be removed from office, all of them have some history of the attempts or the actual cases where it's happened. But there's no way to predict the future and know whether that's going to be relevant in the near term. And sure enough, in the past couple of years, one by one, almost every chapter has been checked off as something that has led the news on a particular night or for a particular week or month. We did have the impeachment of the president. It was a successful impeachment because he was impeached, but he was not removed by the Senate. We have had plenty of talk about disability, most recently with COVID-19. But even before then, there was a lot of chatter about, were the vice president and the cabinet considering removing him for being unable to exercise the duties of the office? And then, of course, we've had all kinds of issues related to how he came into office in the first place. So it has been the gift that keeps on giving, in a sense, which is every time something comes up involving the president and whether he is unable or unfit or unpopular, there's something in this book that has the history of it. So people don't have to pretend that this is the first time it's ever happened. Instead, you can look back at the cases in history when it's happened and said, what can we learn from those? Whether you want to speed the president out of office or whether you want to prevent that from happening, there was something in American history that we can bring forward and use to illuminate the present moment.
So one of the differences that struck me is thinking about the Obama era and the Trump era. Now, of course, there were serious people who alleged that Obama should not be president either, usually on the grounds that he was in some way not an American citizen, which we know to be spurious. But that chatter was continuous. It never completely went away. There was part of the electorate that believed that in some way the Obama presidency was illegitimate. But still, it continued through 8 years. There was never a serious moment where you thought one or other of the two houses was going to actually, invoke this process and do anything against the president. Right. The difference with Trump is that some part of this conversation was there even before the man had left Trump Towers in New York and got to Washington. Yeah. So counterintuitive though it may be to a lot of people, and indeed perhaps to my personal feeling and yours, was Trump a little bit hard done by? Did we start invoking the getting rid of this presidency prematurely before the man had really had a chance to even sit behind the desk? And has it now got to a point where we run the risk that nobody is going to be ever allowed to be a legitimate president?
That's a fair point. And it wasn't just Trump. If you remember back to the summer and the fall of 2016, there were people calling for the impeachment of Hillary Clinton before she was elected, and there were people calling for the impeachment of Donald Trump should he be elected. So it did cut both ways. There certainly has developed in the past few decades a trend in American politics, and some people just call it hyper-partisanship or hyper-polarization, but I think it's something more than that. We've developed this, if you will, demonization of the presidency. And that's not to say that all periods of American history were about, meadows and unicorns and rainbows and rivers of chocolate. It wasn't glorious political contests where people loved one another. There were some pretty vicious contests in the past, but they were usually restricted to the margins. And it wasn't entering the mainstream political dialogue that not only is this candidate a bad choice politically, but this candidate is fundamentally unfit for office in a way that makes them instantly disqualified, even if they're elected. That has really evolved. I started seeing it more in the 1990s than in any other recent time in modern history. Perhaps it had been quelled by the Cold War and the perception of an outside threat, but certainly the release after the Cold War certainly led in the Clinton administration for people in mainstream media to release much more hatred toward the person of the president than we had seen as the average going back through Eisenhower and Carter and Reagan and even Bush 41. That certainly continued with Bush 43. Regardless of what you feel about his policy choices, there were some people who were calling him names that I don't recall even Ronald Reagan being called. And then, of course, with Obama and Trump, the acceleration has gone on. I'm not sure that genie can be put back in the bottle. I think once you get used to the fact that the president of the United States isn't a person, but is a demon if you don't agree with them, and therefore you can use dehumanizing language about them, that's a nasty thing to go down. And it takes a real national conversation about how do we want to be? How do we want to treat people with whom we disagree? When we say we are better than this, do we mean it? And are we going to act in that way? Or are we deluding ourselves and we're saying we're better than this, but we only mean it towards people we agree with? That's a fundamental choice I think we have to make as a society, and it's not just about the politicians.
I feel that when it comes to the demonization of the presidency, this is where I think Donald Trump's personal style has certainly added to people's willingness to demonize, and you know, he's brought on himself. If he isn't re-elected, and we're having this conversation when we have no idea what's going to happen in the election, although Biden is at the moment solidly ahead in the polls. But if Trump is not re-elected, then some of that feels like poetic justice, because his language and his divisive language for the country as a whole has been part of his strategy for government. It seems. So he would be a president were he not to be re-elected, who only serves one term. And as you point out, that's not all that common these days. The last time I think that happened was George H.W. Bush.
Right.
So so this is bizarre. George H.W. Bush is probably the last president that most of the country actually now thinks they liked. And how is it that we managed not to have a bit more of him, but to throw him out prematurely? And instead of which, you know, we start this kind of wild partisan swing between the Clintons and then the Bushes and then the Obamas and now this.
Yeah, here's my speculation, and it's only that because I haven't delved into the political science research and other elements to prove that I'm right. But it's a hunch that when Bush got us through, and he did as Americans, Bush got us through the end of the Cold War without shots being fired in anger. And no one would have predicted that decades earlier. It certainly didn't look like the Soviet Union would just crumble and the United States would manage the process with its European allies in such a way as to prevent absolute destruction from happening as at least a corollary to it, if not core to the very issue of its collapse. When Bush managed to do that, I think there was some sense, perhaps not even conscious in the American people that, you know what, we can exhale now. We can let our guard down a little bit. And yes, we happen to have in office George Herbert Walker Bush, one of the most qualified people for the presidency in all of American history. But there's this cool guy who goes on late night talk shows and plays the saxophone, and he makes jokes, and he kind of winks at the camera when talking about the fact that he hasn't always been a good husband. And, you know, that's kind of fun. Maybe we need an entertaining president instead of a fully competent one. And I know that's a caricature of them, but there is some element of that in the public perceptions in 1992. And I think Donald Trump is really the extension of that. If you're going to go for a president who is more entertainment than substance, Donald Trump is the poster child. He's someone who is in the public consciousness mostly because of his self-promotion in the 1980s in New York, and then due to a TV show more recently. He takes that trend to a new level. But you raise an interesting point. If he is a one-term president, which would be the first time since George H.W. Bush, coming on the heels of 3 successive 2-term presidents. That's Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, all being reelected to a second term for only the second time in US history. You have to go all the way back to Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe for that to have happened. If Donald Trump is rejected for a second term after this feeling of the power of incumbency in the presidency, that is a stern rebuke to much, if not all, of what Trump stood for. And in fact, it could be an awakening moment of people saying, yes, we've given the presidency a lot of institutional power. And yeah, we kind of like being entertained. We can't look away from the TV when things are going wrong for the president. But we really didn't want it like this. This is too far. Let's go back to the norm, at least somewhat, and be a little bit prouder of the person we put into the Oval Office instead of looking just for some kind of morbid entertainment.
We kind of tiptoed around one subject that your book obviously deals with because it's sort of painful and awkward. But as you point out, 4 presidencies have ended because of violence, where the president has been killed in office. And there are different circumstances that attend on each one of these. You could certainly say that one is the act of a more or less a lunatic, an individual lunatic. Yeah. One was probably the last shot fired in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So it seems right now that, firstly, that presidential candidates are very well protected and that they ought to be safer than ever. But it doesn't feel as though these are the safest circumstances in which an election has ever been conducted. And I say that only because we know that a lot of people have bought a lot of guns over the last several years. And we have seen people willing to bring those guns to public demonstrations, which in the past, would have been probably conducted with people with placards. Now we're seeing people with placards and sidearms, or indeed rifles.
Right.
So, what's the story of political violence and ending presidencies? It hasn't happened very often. We don't want to make it seem as though it's a feature of American life. It really isn't. But when it's happened, have there been any kind of essential preconditions that have made it seem, if not inevitable, then just less shocking than it might otherwise be?
Yeah, the flip side of that there are weapons showing up at political rallies, and obviously there have been some cases of violence. The flip side to that, and maybe it's me trying to be a silver lining guy, and the cup is half full, not half empty, but we have a recency bias when it comes to violence and politics. Because we have had a relatively tranquil past few decades, I mean, we forget the fact that in the 1970s, bombs were going off in the streets of New York City virtually every day from the Weather Underground and other organizations during the Vietnam protests. We forget the fact that people were shot and killed when trying to vote, often based on the color of their skin, or lynchings happened during election season. And that's just what happened in certain parts of the country. So the fact that there are people carrying guns near elections, and there are people conducting weird plots like trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan because they don't like her policies, that is bad. There's no doubt about that, and that should be condemned. But it is not that aberrant compared to other periods of American history when often there was significant violence around political issues and around elections. We've actually relatively got it pretty good. Now, that's not an excuse to let down. If anything, that is motivation to do even better and remove those fringe elements before they gain traction again. I am very pleased that regardless of how you feel about this administration, that we have not seen assassination attempts left and right. That is not the way to carry out an effective political process, and it leads to a solution where everyone loses, whether that's due to good protection or whether that's due to the fact that everybody can be enraged on Twitter and everybody can go on Reddit and say nasty things, but they don't actually take that final step to try to get into the White House with a gun. I don't know what the dynamic behind that is, but I think that's a relatively positive thing. In the past, when we had assassinations of political leaders, the causes were all over the place. As you mentioned, it could be somebody who is mentally unstable, and that does appear to be the most common source of threats to the president and other leaders. But you also did have what I would call politically oriented assassinations. People who espoused a different political view than the leader and said, I need to take this person out. Unlike much of the world, thankfully, the United States has not seen as much of that. And that is a good thing for all concerned, regardless of how you feel about the policies. The most dangerous thing that could happen, Clive, is if this election goes forward, and maybe we get through the rest of the campaign without any significant violence, but based on the outcome of the election, then people decide to take up arms and actually start committing violent acts against one another. It almost happened once before, in particular, back in 1876 and 1877, when Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, lost to Rutherford B. Hayes, but only due to some really funny business going on with the election returns from several states that gave Hayes one electoral vote more than he needed to win. And you had Tilden supporters basically taking up arms, recruiting Minutemen to form militias, saying, go ahead and swear yourself in, Mr. Tilden. We will be there to make sure you are president. He said no. He said, nope, the institutions of this country matter more than what was probably a fraudulent election. Let's just do better next time and win at the polls. Okay, that's a high road to take when you have just been essentially removed preemptively from the presidency. But it's an important one. And it's a norm that has held through all US presidential elections. Even during the Civil War, you did not have the loser saying, well, I disagree with the election result and I'm not going to accept it, and we're going to take the office by force. We don't have that institution in American history. But that's what worries me more this time, because a lot of the rhetoric is heated. And even though it hasn't taken the campaign over, in the post-election period, that's where I think we need to be focusing even more of our energy.
I think we should wrap it up there with the Tilden example in front of us and hope that the candidates and their supporters remember it very, very well. And I want to thank you, David, for joining us on The Current today. It's a wonderful journey through American presidential history, which is really a fascinating story, if nothing else, as a series of power plays. Thank you for being our guide. Thank you for talking us through those examples, and thank you for your book.
You're welcome, and thank you for the platform. It's always good to know history and to talk about history so we can do even better in the future, and I appreciate it.
Hachette,